A lot of people wanted to hate on Jedi Fallen Order right out the gate because of EA's recent blunders and terrible business practices, but I gotta say, them and I suppose more specifically Respawn have crafted a fantastic game here. It gave me up to 30 hours of really awesome gameplay. Played it in maximum difficulty too, which was very well executed. We'll talk about that in the review. I'll try to give you all the information you need to piece together whether or not you're gonna enjoy this, and if it's a buy for you or not. So brew a coffee, get ready, and let's go. Let's kick it off with graphical presentation here. The game boasts a very high standard of visuals, a lot of fidelity in the facial animations, and overall the mocap is really well executed, especially for the main character. When you look at Cal's facial animations and how he talks for every line that's said, even when he's out in the world and doing stuff, it's really all well done. There are some exceptions to this. When it comes to some of the secondary characters, you know, the Wookiees look positively awful and disturbing. Also, Sears, your main sidekick in the adventure, her facial animations also look a little bit weird and off-putting in how her eyes are just kind of bulging out of their sockets for some reason. But outside of that, overall, you should expect a very high level of graphical presentation here. When it comes to the different worlds you're going to visit, most of them are highly diverse and offer high level, you know, detailed textures and all of that stuff that you would expect at this level of budget. There is one planet that I'll just mention the name, which is Dathomir here. When you get to that, I felt like it was a bit of a downgrade. When it comes to presentation, it felt a little bit drab compared to some of the other planets. But that just highlights how good the other planets are in terms of graphical presentation. Some of them focus more on the flora side with, you know, just very diverse flora. Others have just weird animals coming at you. And then some others really focus more on the side of just the Galactic Empire presence, whether it's different stations or structures or just groups of soldiers from the Galactic Empire populating the planet. So with all of that, it gives you a very broad array of different planets to visit. Even though the actual number of total planets isn't very high, it comes together very nicely where you are often exploring different types of biomes, and different enemies have unique ways of attacking you and using the environment against you in cool ways. And speaking of the Galactic Empire presence, all of the structures and just infrastructure from the Empire that you see here is in line with the usual Star Wars look, and they really nailed that feel, the overall Star Wars vibe and signature. Everything seems to connect with that world really well. I did notice a severe lack of weird alien species. This is a big thing, right? Whenever you go into a Star Wars movie, the scene in the pub, almost a mandatory scene in a pub, where you get to see at least like 5 different weird alien races. That stuff doesn't happen here as often. Even though you see a lot of crazy fauna and flora, like I said, you don't really interact with a lot of weird alien races, which I would have liked and would have added to the experience quite a lot. And lastly, I'll mention there are some awesome boss designs here. Not only in how they look, but also how they blend with the environments, how they use the environments in what feels like a natural way. And just some really original ideas in how they're constructed, the actual model of the enemy. And the weapons, how they look, there's always a bit of a curveball as to they're familiar and you kind of know what to expect, but there's always a uniqueness there for each boss. And they have a unique way of using those to attack you and come at you with them. Let's go to gameplay. The first thing that jumps to mind is the great selection of skills you have here. Some really awesome moves that can be combined with others, and how you choose to combine them and which ones you choose to get first can really change the way your gameplay looks. In fact, I'd be willing to say that my gameplay probably looks a lot different from yours or somebody else's because the game supports so many different playstyles. Do you like parrying? You can go nuts with that. Do you like just blocking maybe you're more of a dodging slash rolling person, or you can be more aggressive about it, more proactive, and use aggressive skills to create openings instead of just reacting to what the enemy is doing. So really you have a breadth of options here when it comes to combat, and the skills really just are a big enabler to that. Now, this wouldn't be any good if the controls were shit, and they're not, which is a great asset in the game. The fact that the controls are intuitive with so much going on, so many different skills that you can have at one point in time. I'll say this, I rarely found myself in the situation where I was pressing the wrong button for the thing I was trying to do. The game has this very natural placement of things around the gamepad, which is what I played it with. I can't speak for mouse and keyboard, but on the gamepad it felt very intuitive, like I say, and I think some games need to take a page out of this, because I have found myself in that situation in many other games where I was consistently doing something that is not what I was trying to do. In other words, the gamepad was a bit of a barrier between what I wanted to do and what was happening in the game, and it never felt that way here. So the other piece that feeds into this is the responsiveness of the combat. I was positively surprised with this, and there's a real fluidity there. It never felt like you kind of stopped your motion. There was a real momentum going on. And also, it was accurate enough that I never felt that I died because of some kind of lag input or something clumsy like that. It was always quite tight, and it allowed me to really be accountable for my own mistakes, which is a very important thing in a game like this that does offer higher difficulty levels. And speaking of higher difficulty levels, the game, of course, offers you a breadth of options here. Not only do you get the usual normal, easy, or hard, but you actually see exactly how that choice is going to impact your gameplay in terms of the amount of reaction time you're going to be allowed, or, you know, maybe the damage that's going to be dealt to you. All of that stuff is kind of visually indicated in the menu before you choose. And I think that needs to be more present in games. Really, the word normal or hard or easy don't convey enough information to the player in terms of what he or she is signing up for. The other thing here is that many times games will just inflate the HP pools of enemies and call it hard mode. That's not hard mode, that's just extra patience mode, right? Or whatever you want to call it. But here, it really does not revolve around that at all, which was very, very refreshing to see. Instead, like I said, it revolves around other parameters that felt really fair for me, you know, and very conducive to a great experience at higher difficulty. Maybe the biggest small thing that I enjoy here is reflecting projectiles with the lightsaber. This feels so satisfying. When you're fighting some guys and from the back you hear someone shoot you, you block, and if you time it right, you send it back to the guy that shoot you, and he gets shot with his own bullet. Or laser. It's the most satisfying thing in the game by far for some reason. And you can also just block and know that you will deflect, but if you get the timing right, you will also send it back, reflect the shot, which is a really cool thing and really well executed here. We talked about boss designs in the prior section, and this is a highlight in this one as well, because not only do they look unique, but they also have very interesting ways of using the environments and their weapons against you. So again, even if the weapons ring a bell or they're very familiar, they do have a distinct way of using that. Maybe they have a very unique move set, or maybe they use something in the environment to throw you off your game. Even the smaller bosses throughout the game provided an interesting challenge. Even if they weren't very difficult per se, it was always stimulating and a very, very enticing experience throughout. I do have a couple of negatives here, one of them being the backtracking. There's no fast travel in the game, so when you finish a location, you typically always have to walk your way back to the ship, which involves, well, backtracking all of your steps, essentially. And typically there are shortcuts unlocked, so this is made easier by that, but it never felt necessary. In other words, I would have just liked to have some ability to go back to my ship or some safe, just fast travel functionality there to expedite things. The other quibble I have is that the map can be absolutely overwhelming at first. It almost reminded me of Borderlands 3, but of course that one was just almost unusable. And here it is usable, but it takes quite a bit of time to get used to it and to how to get the information out of it. Once you do, you can operate with it quite well, but I gotta say at first I was just lost in it, and I chose to actually ignore it for the most part and just traverse the game world and try to make my way through it that way. One other thing to be aware of is that enemies do respawn when you rest at save spots, and this is something that, in a game like Dark Souls kind of makes sense and connects narratively, but here it doesn't. It really doesn't. The fact that I cleaned an area of enemies and just because I did a quick meditation, they happen to reappear, that to me is just baffling from a narrative standpoint and never felt right. It just always was a bit at odds with what the game was trying to tell me. But from a gameplay loop standpoint, it works fairly well. And, again, that compromise of, do I want to heal versus do I want to just have a clear area for me to be able to traverse? It provides a good risk-reward system, but again, felt a little bit weird here. Another important element in the game is the puzzles and the traversing of just platforming sections. The platforming side is quite trivial and it's almost a roller coaster ride. Nothing's gonna go wrong even if they try to make it seem so, but it's quite enjoyable. Again, people like roller coasters for a reason, right? And it's not because they think they might die in a ride. Instead, you just enjoy the ride and that's great. It's kind of like that for me here. A little bit reminiscent of Uncharted games where there's never a question as to what can be climbed or where you can go. All of that stuff is quite well telegraphed, maybe to its detriment, but it was enjoyable nonetheless. When it comes to the puzzles, none of them were particularly difficult, let's say, but most of them were stimulating enough that when I did find a solution, it was kind of cool. Some of the secrets force you to find interesting workarounds to problems that they present, so they're overall pretty good. I do have one final complaint in the gameplay territory, which is when enemies attack you, there's two things that can happen if you attack them first. One is that your attack goes through and you do damage to them, but they still attack you despite of that. The other one is that you interrupt their attack because you hit them first. The second one makes a lot more sense to me, especially if you're fighting, let's say, a human enemy. That enemy should be faced by the fact that I hit him with a lightsaber, and he or she should not be able to attack me through that, in my mind. So it annoys me when games are inconsistent with that particular behavior, and here you see that often. A lot of enemies are interrupted if you attack them first, but then a lot of them, especially bosses of course, are not interrupted by your attacks, while of course they interrupt your attacks. So that's not totally fair, is it? I just prefer a fair, battleground where both the enemy and yourself can interrupt each other with attacks if you get the timing right. Next up is music and sound. Overall, the soundtrack is very pleasing. It's hitting similar themes, but it's definitely a departure from the original. And in fact, I think they try really hard to depart from the original while retaining some of the same themes. You hear some of the melodies come up in a reorchestrated way and very subtly so, but you never hear the same kind of original soundtrack that hits very hard from a nostalgia standpoint that you would expect, especially when you start the game and you're just thrust into it without any of the signature Star Wars music pop up. It's a little odd, and I wonder why they went with that decision, with that direction of staying away from the original stuff so much, when I think it would have added to the experience overall. When it comes to actual sound effects, the game is spot on. lightsabers sound amazing, as they should. They should nail that. If they don't, it's a problem, right? It's a bit like plumbing. You never think about it, but if it goes wrong, it's a big problem, right? Luckily here, it is not a problem, and it works very well. Deflecting shots, hitting other lightsabers right on, all of that stuff, really good. When it comes to voice acting, across the board, I would say this is excellent. There are some standouts. I would say Cal is fantastic. The actor that portrays him does a great job. He's, of course, also well known for other great roles that he's done, and he brings that knowledge and skill set to the job here very well. All of his expressions, when it comes to facial expressions, connect well with what he's delivering in the voice acting, and that works to convey what he's going through in some of these traumatic events during the campaign. Other characters are less well executed. I would say Seer, I know a lot of people thought she was a standout, and I think that's great. I don't think she did a bad job, but it didn't feel like anything exceptional to me, where some other smaller characters actually surprised me. A worthy mention here is one of the first characters you come across when you're working at this station in the beginning of the game, and his delivery felt so nuanced for what was going on. It actually surprised me and stayed with me throughout the game, even though maybe the character didn't. But it's just one of those things that a really kick-ass voice acting performance can really stay with you, even if it's not a major character. Lastly, let's talk about the story. It's a safe plot, safely delivered, and that's not a problem here. I think this is exactly what we needed. A good, solid, single-player Jedi game that gives you a solid 20 to 30 hours experience. For me, it was 30 hours. And very enjoyable. You get through it, you have a lightsaber, things work, it sounds great, it looks great, it's fun to play. That's the juice for me. Now, coupled with that, it's a fairly serviceable and interesting story with interesting characters as well. They got their backstories, and over time, you start to figure out what drives them. Maybe there's, a hidden side to them, or maybe something a little troubling that you start to figure out about some of your companions. And all of that stuff works really well. Also, as you explore the different planets, the more you explore them, you get lore on different fauna and flora that's interesting and kind of solidifies the world a little bit. And as well as enemies. So you learn a little bit about the different enemies within the Galactic Empire, what functions they serve in there. As a whole, it provides quite a bit of grounding for the whole experience to take place. In conclusion then, should you go out and buy this game? I would argue yes, and I'll give you my closing arguments for that, in case all of the information before wasn't enough. I would say the accessibility is a very strong point here, because it brings the typically inaccessible stamina-based combat style of games to a framework where you can customize your experience based on whether you want a challenge or not, and with very specific parameters that translate to how it's going to affect your gameplay. So from that standpoint, I think it's going to be way less niche than some of those other games typically are. Compounding with that, it also offers a really polished presentation when it comes to graphics, music, sounds. All of that stuff connects and gives you a very solid single-player experience with no microtransactions, no bullshit. So there you go, guys. It's a very solid Jedi game, finally, and I'm really happy for that. I can't wait to see more like this come out. Maybe a Sith game in this vein as well. So if you enjoyed the video, remember, you can catch me live on Twitch and have a discussion about this or many other things. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Saturdays. Link down below. And as always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.